I've got to start it off with this. This build is weird. It's really, really weird. It feels like it shouldn't come together as well as it does, but it really does perform well. It doesn't do anything in a normal way and doesn't play like what you'd think a good build would play like, but after really testing and pushing the build, you'll begin to find that it's doing things that meta builds are doing. Great damage, good survivability, really low cooldowns, but most importantly, this build is both fun to use and fun to just watch. Literally everything on your screen will be green. Your enemies will be green, you'll be green, you'll literally have tangles flying through the air, you'll probably be flying through the air, and your abilities kind of just autopilot themselves, whilst giving you some really good benefits. You just throw them out, let them do their thing, whilst you just focus on whatever else you need to do. But that's enough lip flapping from me, let's actually get into what you came here for. The exotic armor we're using in this build are the Radiant Dance Machines, although I'm calling them RDMs from here. With RDMs on, when dodging near an enemy, you will get the multi-dodge buff for 6 seconds, which removes the cooldown on your dodge as long as the buff is up. On killing an enemy, and no matter what tier they are, you'll extend the timer by 5 seconds up to a max of 11. There are some really important interactions to bring up here, because this exotic is specifically coded to not work with some mods. When using any dodge after the first one that activates multi-dodge, you will not receive any benefits from Bomber, Distribution, Dynamo, or Outreach. They will work on the first dodge, but none of the ones afterwards during the multi-dodge. However, Reaper, which on using your class ability will make your next kill spawn an orb, does work with the RDMs, but since late last year, Reaper has had a built-in cooldown, meaning you can spam dodges with RDM buff, but you can't get an orb on every kill after you dodge. There is a way to somewhat get around this, but I'll talk about that more in the mod setup section. There are also 2 aspects that won't activate on any dodges during multi-dodge, but for this build the only one you need to be aware of is that Threaded Spectre will only be made on the first dodge. Any after during multi-dodge will not make the clone. Also be aware that Ensnaring Slam, whenever it is used, will fully consume your class ability and not proc multi-dodge. It doesn't matter if you immediately Ensnaring Slam, or whether you've dodged 30 times already during multi-dodge, and then Ensnaring Slam, at whatever point it is used, it will both fully consume your dodge and take away your multi-dodge. Talking about dodging, the one you'll be picking up here is Gamblers, which will fully refund your melee energy when dodging near an enemy. And there's only one Strand melee you can take here, which is the Threaded Spike, which I genuinely think people sleep on way too much, because it does a lot for you when you really look into some of its effects and then build around them. Threaded Spike, when thrown, will bounce between a maximum of 9 enemies, dealing 18% less damage on the second enemy it bounces to, and then 42.5% less on every enemy past the second bounce. On reaching max bounces, or when no more enemies can be hit by the Threaded Spike, it will boomerang back to you, and depending on how many enemies it hits, it will recharge a portion of your melee energy. It will always return to you, but if you catch it on its way back, you'll regen way more energy, with hitting 5 or more actually fully refunding it if you manage to catch it. Nothing to really do with the build, but it's almost like you're playing some quick time event, where you've got to get the timing just right, but if you do, you get a chunk of melee energy back. I'll put the numbers on the screen, but the idea is simple. Catch it and you'll get more energy back, don't and you'll get less. For your super, there's only one option, which is Silk Strike. You've got a light attack which does a forward attack with the tip of the rope dealing increased damage and causing enemies to explode if they die, then a heavy, which is an AoE around you, and your grenade is replaced with the grapple grenade, which doesn't drain any super energy on use and can be spammed. It's not a crazy super, but not bad by any means. One thing that is really important though, and fundamental to this build, is that any enemy killed while affected by a Strand debuff, which is Sever, Unravel, or Suspend, will spawn a Tangle, which is a throwable explosion. From that Tangle spawning in, you then can't make another Tangle for 12 seconds. The reason why it's important to understand this is because the one aspect that you absolutely have to run with this build is Whirling Maelstrom, which directly affects our tangles, so understanding how they are spawned is important. Typically, when destroying a tangle by shooting or throwing it, it'll just do a small explosion, but with the Whirling Maelstrom aspect on, destroying or throwing a tangle will make it do its normal explosion, but then it will start Beyblading around, hunting down anything near it. If it kills anything, that target will then release unraveling threads, which will then seek out anything near them and unravel anything they hit. Again, this aspect is the one that you really need to find success with this build. Not only because by itself it does great damage, but it will also spread Unravel, which will release Strand threads, which will then deal damage and reapply Unravel to any target that's already hit by the debuff. Whenever you see green darts flying off an enemy, that's Unravel doing its thing. But before going over the second aspect you can take, let's go over your grenade options. As for your grenades, I would normally recommend the Shackle Grenade, which will suspend anything hit by them. It's really nice as it just lifts enemies out of fights, as well as it being a Strand debuff, meaning a tangle spawn off of killing a suspended enemy. But because of the Whirling Maelstrom, I'm also going to recommend the Grapple Grenade as another option for you to pick. Any tangle you grapple, you fully refund your grapple, but quite a lot of people don't know that whilst Whirling Maelstrom is Beyblading, it still counts as being grappleable, which will not only fully refund your grapple, but then allow you to follow up with the grapple melee, and with that you'll then unravel anything hit by that melee, which will then immediately start shooting out unraveling threads, because your Whirling Maelstrom will be ticking for loads of small bits of damage, which will keep on proccing Unravel. Genuinely, both grenades here are really valid options. Shackle is nice and endgame content, but at the same time don't sleep on how much damage the grapple melee can do with Maelstrom and unraveling threads going off. It is way more damage than you might think at first for both ag clear and damaging high health targets. I will mention throughout this build when I think you should run certain fragments and aspects depending on the grenade you pick, so keep an ear out for that because they both have very different playstyles and require different fragments. But for your second aspect, this genuinely can be any of them. Threaded Spectre will spawn a Strand clone when you dodge, which will take aggro off you, and when destroyed by either taking enough damage when something gets too close, it'll explode, dealing damage and sending out 2 Threadlings, which will seek out targets and do AoE damage. As mentioned before, it'll only spawn on the first dodge, but it's really nice for taking some pressure off you and being able to give you some time to set up spreading Sever with your melee and getting your RDM buff going. Ensnaring Slam will let you spend your class ability energy to suspend anything around you when you land. As mentioned before, this will both not activate multi-dodge on landing and will also fully bring you out of your multi-dodge if you've got the buff active. The nice thing about this though is let's say that your multi-dodge is going to run out anyway and there's something with loads of health like a champion in front of you, you can just Ensnaring Slam it pretty much for free. Your dodge would have just ended anyways, so you might as well finish your multi-dodge with something useful. This aspect also works really well if you're going for the grapple version of this build, because it gives you a bit of CC for high-end content and unstoppable stun if you need it as a replacement to the Shackle Grenades. On the other hand, if you're wanting to go down the Shackle Grenade route, you can for sure be confident that Widow's Silk is a good aspect to run. It's a bit like Threaded Spectre, where it takes aggro off you, but literally by stringing people up in the air with Suspend. You lose out on some of the Threadling damage, but you get a lot more CC. I generally don't pick Widow's Silk if I'm doing the grapple grenade stuff, just because it fully refunds itself on grappling a tangle or a Beyblading tangle, so I never really need more than one grapple. But again, your choice for the second aspect is exactly that, your choice. You can really pick whatever suits your playstyle more, as any of these will work well. For fragments though, there is a bit less flexibility, but the one you absolutely must have, one that is not swappable, is Thread of Warding, which on picking up an Orb of Power will give you Woven Mail for 10 seconds, which is a 45% damage resist. This is the second survivability tool in our kit outside of Sever, and our mod setup is building hard into making orbs because Woven Mail in this build is so important. This fragment genuinely is what makes this build work at high end content. Between Woven Mail giving 45% damage resist and Sever from Threaded Spike, reducing enemies' outgoing damage by 40%, we can tank a lot of damage if we play it right. Your next fragment should be the Thread of Continuity, which will increase the duration of any Strand debuffs applied to enemies by 50% in most cases. This will make any Sever we apply go from 10 seconds to 15. Unravel already reapplies itself, so that one isn't massively impactful, and Suspend will hit mini-bosses for 4 seconds instead of 3, and anything lower tier than a mini-boss goes for 7 seconds instead of 5. The main thing here is that Sever gets a really nice time bump when our melee applies it. Another must-have fragment in this build is Thread of Propagation, which on powered melee kills will give your Strand weapons unraveling rounds for 8 seconds. Whilst you shouldn't focus on spamming your melee to get kills with it obviously will happen, and being able to get unraveling rounds off of it really helps in ad clear, as well as applying it to something like a boss or a champion for more chip damage. And again, unraveling rounds is a Strand debuff, which means a Tangle spawn, which means Whirling Maelstrom off of Unravel. For this last one you have a few choices, but mess around with it and get a feel for what suits you best. If you want my recommendations, if you've chosen to go for Shackle Grenades, Thread of Generation could work here, as the grenade cooldown is really nice, and with all the damage checks from Whirling Maelstrom and Unravel, you'll be getting your Shackle Grenades back way faster. Thread of Wisdom or Thread of Mind for an Orb, or Class Ability Energy respectively, on killing a suspended target can work here too. For the grapple setup, if you're using Ensnaring Slam, you could again go for Thread of Wisdom or Thread of Mind. If you're not feeling either of those, Thread of Rebirth is a nice neutral game fragment, just for more chances to make threadlings for a bit of extra damage. I'll cover it in a bit after the mod setup, but if you're watching this during Season 23, Season of the Wish, Thread of Evolution could work really well here because it has great synergy with one of the seasonal artifact mods. Speaking of the mod setup, it is designed to make as many orbs as possible to really benefit from being able to get Woven Mail from picking up an orb from Thread of Warden. On the helmet, you'll want a Siphon mod, which can either be Harmonic or one of the dual Siphon mods from the seasonal artifact. You'll also want to take hands-on for more super energy on melee kills. Just also be aware that the Grapple Grenade melee counts as a melee ability, so it'll benefit from any of the melee mods in this build. On your arms, you'll want one copy of Focusing Strike, which on dealing damage with a powered melee attack will give you class ability energy, and you'll want one copy of Heavy Handed, which on a powered melee final blow will make an orb. On your chest, just add in resistance mods for whatever activity you're going into. On your legs, I recommend running one copy of a Surge mod for whatever your most common element is. And here, you're also going to want to add one copy of Better Already, which on picking up an orb starts health regen, and Recuperation, which on picking up an orb will give you a small health bump. This is just because whilst we have debuffs and damage resist, we don't have a reliable way to heal, which these mods will enable for us. On your class item, you're wanting one copy of Powerful Attraction, which on using your class ability will pick up orbs in an area around you, and then 2 copies of Reaper, which on dodging will make your next weapon kill spawn an orb. The reason we're running 2 copies of Reaper is it has an internal cooldown after making an orb, which starts at 10 seconds with 1 copy, but goes down to 5 seconds with 2. And lastly, as for weapons that you're going to want to run with this build, you don't really need anything in particular, but a Strand primary for easily spreading unraveling rounds is really nice. Apart from that, you can literally go with anything. As long as there is something that is Strand that you feel you can confidently spread Unravel with, you'll be good. I did mention in the beginning that there were some perks that this build can uniquely use, and the first of those is Permeability, which on using your class ability will turn the gun's element to your subclass element. I know that this perk is really niche, and in 99.9% of builds it wouldn't work, but in this build where your dodges have no cooldown, it's really easy to proc Permeability, and it's actually worth it because your Strand weapons will be applying Unraveling rounds, meaning you'll get bonus damage from that, and then if you're using a Strand Surge and your Permeability gun is in your energy, you can get Kinetic, Energy, and Heavy, all using Strand to benefit from a Strand Surge buff across every weapon. Genuinely, a perk that you should consider if you haven't already turned every Permeability roll into shards. There aren't loads of guns that roll Permeability, as it's fairly new, but one of the best ones to look out for is Indebted Kindness. The second perk this build can really benefit from as well is Slice, which on using your class ability will apply Sever to the next 5 enemies you hit within 8 seconds. This is not only a damage nerf to enemies, but also means that from just a dodge, we can apply Slice, which again, a Strand debuff, makes a Tangle, which will give us Whirling Maelstrom. But again, this build doesn't really need specific weapons apart from one Strand gun that you can confidently spread Unravel around with. And lastly, before the gameplay segment, are the seasonal mods that you can use during Season of the Wish. There are a few seasonal mods here, but the ones you want over anything else that have a large effect on modifying your gameplay are Unraveling Orbs, which on picking up an orb will give you Unraveling rounds for 7 seconds. Just another way to get Unraveling rounds outside of a powered melee kill. Although where you see a massive change to this build is in Horde Shuffle, which on damaging an unraveled target will spawn a Threadling. Threadlings can only be made with weapon damage, not damage from Whirling Maelstrom or Unraveling Threads, but I promise you, as long as you're lasering down something with a high RPM gun, you'll be spawning so many Threadlings. And these only have a 0.5 second cooldown between being summoned, so genuinely one target will just spawn an absolutely insane amount of Threadlings as long as they're unraveled. As for the gameplay part of this build, there is one point that I really have to hammer home, is that although this build uses Gamblers and Threaded Spike and Radiant Dance Machines, you should not be relying on these to be doing damage in your build. This was the biggest mistake I made when I was first testing this, and it will absolutely kill the potential this setup has. Your Threaded Spike is used to spread Sever as a priority, and if you can, then you can try go for kills with it to get orbs and unraveling rounds. But if you play this build and all you do is dodge, melee, dodge, melee, dodge, melee, dodge, melee, you will find way less success. Working in your weapons will make this feel way more deadly, and once you use the build enough, you'll understand the right times when to melee for Sever, orbs and unravel, and when to use weapons for damage. Think of Threaded Spike as the primer for enemies that enables the rest of your build to work and that makes your survivability go way up. Also, because of Radiant Dance Machines, you really don't need to think about catching your melee. The only time you really have to do this is when your dodge is on cooldown. And remember about the damage drop on Threaded Spike. Aiming the first hit at a target to guarantee a kill will make getting orbs and unraveling rounds much more reliable. As for other tips, if you're not in equipment lock content and you're coming up to a DPS phase, you can just switch to Marksman's Dodge, put on a rocket launcher, and just shoot then dodge and rinse and repeat until you're out of heavy, which is a pretty good way to get some good DPS. If you are running Ensnaring Slam, also be aware that during your super, you can use this ability and spam it if you really want to. It's just a nice benefit if you're using the Ensnaring Slam version of this build. It gives the super a bit more utility. And that's it. I really hope you enjoy taking this out into the game. The main reason I wanted to do this is because it's something people wouldn't think of being strong, but in reality it really has some good strengths. There isn't a piece of content where I wouldn't be confident in this build and what it can do. But more importantly, just to say what I said in the beginning again, it's really fun. That's what I want the builds on this channel to be. Powerful builds that you can take anywhere, but the priority being that you enjoy using them because they're unique or strange or they do something weird and wacky, but don't compromise on being powerful. But anyway, that's about all from me. Hope you enjoyed and see ya.